In this lesson, we'll be discussing tenant name and region. The first thing to realize about tenant names in Office 365 is that Microsoft always provisions new tenants with the onmicrosoft.com domain. You could pick the tenant name, which is what comes before this, but there's no way to skip or prevent this domain suffix from being provisioned. Later, we can add custom domains that we own and set those to default, but the original onmicrosoft.com domain will always be there. So there are some considerations about the tenant name. First of all, Microsoft does not allow duplicate tenant names globally, and this means if a tenant name you're trying to provision already exists or has been reserved by another user, it's unavailable to you. Second, we're not forced to use the onmicrosoft.com domain forever. Once we add our custom domain, we don't have to worry about this tenant name so much anymore. The exception is SharePoint Online. The initial tenant name has to be used as part of the SharePoint Online URL. Therefore, you don't want to pick a tenant name that's difficult to type or not meant to be seen. The SharePoint Online URLs cannot be customized. Now, there was a SharePoint Public Website service that allowed for custom domains, but SharePoint Public Website services are no longer available. Now it's just team sites, and those have to have the original tenant name in the URL. Tenant name can also only contain letters and numbers, so you cannot use symbols or dots. This means you can't simulate subtenants or subdomains such as lab.mytenant.onmicrosoft.com. It has to be a one-word phrase. You also can't use offensive terms, and although you may not think that's an issue, there are certain abbreviations or words that when placed together form offensive words that you don't realize. I remember a list of badly named websites that was floating around the internet back in the 90s, and one that I remember is Penn Island. And if you write down Penn Island, you may see why certain names could be flagged as offensive, even if they're not meant to be. So just to reiterate, you can't rename the onmicrosoft.com domain, you can't rename your team site URL, and you can't remove your onmicrosoft.com domain. As you will see, however, this is not usually an obstacle or roadblock to moving to Office 365. So when you sign up for Office 365, Microsoft is provisioning a tenant in the onmicrosoft.com domain namespace, which is hosted in Azure Active Directory. That means all the user accounts and resources that we'll be creating in Office 365 will have Azure Active Directory user objects and resource objects. When we add a custom domain, we can then change the user principal name, the email address, and the login address, and any other reference to the users or tenant resources to the new domain, with, as mentioned, the exception of SharePoint Online URLs. In order to do this, we must first prove that we have authoritative control over the DNS for the domain that we're trying to add, and Microsoft refers to this as confirming ownership. Once we have proven that we own the domain, which we'll go over in Objective 1.2, Office 365 will then give us DNS records to add in order to configure Office 365 services. This means that there needs to be a public DNS server that Office 365 can reach that contains the DNS namespace for the custom domain that we're adding. So this has to be a public domain, not a non-public or non-routable domain such as yourcompany.local. The authoritative DNS name servers might belong to the domain registrar, a web hosting service, or your internal DNS servers that can respond to public queries. In addition, Office 365 gives you the option to manage DNS for you, but this is generally for very small environments. Picking the correct country or region is important. You cannot change this once the tenant is created. This is because it affects what data center is selected to host the Office 365 services. Since it cannot be changed, you want to make sure you select the correct country or region because it will also affect a few things such as the performance of your Office 365 environment, mostly because you will have a better experience by picking a data center that's closer to you. Also, it will affect the availability of offerings. For example, certain regions may have restrictions on integration with the public telephone network or encryption. Selecting a region that's not in your area, either on purpose or by accident, and thus gaining access to services that are not legally available in your region, means you're not in legal compliance. You can, however, have global users that exist outside your region. As we'll see, one of the mandatory fields when creating a user is to specify the country for that user, and functionality will be allocated accordingly so you don't accidentally give them access to services in their area that they shouldn't have. As users move around, you can also change their location in Office 365 to reflect the new services they can use, but unlike users, the tenant region is fixed and should be chosen accurately for compliance purposes. Finally, whatever region you pick affects the currency used during billing, and if you pick the wrong region, you're likely to be billed in the wrong currency, and that introduces currency risk, which could affect how much you pay for the services on a monthly basis. Okay, next up we'll be discussing the initial global admin.